All right. Hey, everyone. Welcome to our webinar. The DOT test types could be one of the most complicated and misunderstood, and it's return duty and follow-up tests. And today's webinar is going to touch on that. Today's webinar is DOT SAP, the process after a driver tests positive on a drug test. I'm Luke Kibbe. I'm going to be your moderator and speaker today. A little bit about me. I'm the Business Development and Marketing Manager for Glowstone Trucking Solutions, a trucking compliance third party with help with field taxes and licensing authorities, permits, driver training, ELDs, etc. And also the Marketing Manager for Clean Fleet, third party drug and alcohol testing company and consortium. And I'm dedicated to helping both Glowstone and Clean Fleet become the thought leader for the trucking industry and the drug and alcohol industry, specifically, with the news information that we're putting out there. And in fact, several of my articles that I've written has appeared in Fleet Owner magazine and actually the next DAISHA magazine, which is the Drug and Alcohol Industry Association. Their next magazine's cover is going to be on our article on the DOT Drug and Alcohol Clearinghouse. So you might be seeing that as well, and that's us. Before we get started, I do want to mention a couple of things. First of all, this webinar is interactive and your phones will be muted, so please, if you have any questions, submit them in the chat box. I've submitted one thing already saying that we're starting now. I'm going to keep an eye on the chat box throughout the webinar, and at the end we'll have a Q&A session and I can answer any of those questions. Lastly, this webinar is being recorded and you'll be receiving this presentation and the link of the recording after the webinar. Usually gives me about 24 hours and I can send it out. So maybe Friday morning is actually going to be my timeline to try to get it out to you, maybe lunchtime. So keep an eye on that out in your email tomorrow. So with that, we're going to get started by discussing what a SAP actually is. The SAP, or Substance Abuse Professional, is a person who evaluates employees who have violated a DOT drug and alcohol program regulation and makes recommendations concerning education, treatment, and follow-up testing and aftercare. The SAP represents the major decision point, and in some cases the only decision point, an employer may have in choosing whether or not an employee behind the steering wheel of a school bus, in the cockpit of a plane, at the helm of an oil tanker, at the throttle of a train, in the engineering compartment of a subway car, and or the emergency control valves of a natural gas pipeline. The SAP's responsibility to the public is pretty enormous because all of these rules have required DOT drug testing and if caught positive have to go through that SAP process. So the SAP's advocate for neither the employer nor the employee. Their function is to protect the public interest in safety by professionally evaluating that employee and recommending appropriate education and or treatment, the follow-up tests, and aftercare. And so what are we going to be covering today? We're going to cover some of the statistics on drivers testing positive and for what drugs, especially in the trucking industry. When is it considered a positive drug test result? There's actually a couple different scenarios there. Why the return to duty regulation was created and what it's meant to accomplish. Qualifications of a substance abuse professional. And then we're going to be getting into all the steps that are in the return to duty process. And then how can this process affect non-CDL drivers? Other common questions regarding the return to duty process. The record keeping rules and regulations now, and we're going to talk about the DOT Clearinghouse, Drug and Alcohol Clearinghouse, just a little bit because it's going to be in effect in 2020, but sort of some of the changes that's going to be happening there on where this information is going to be stored. and how can employers simplify this SAP process, or how can someone come alongside them? So let's just dive in on the statistics. Really, with the legalization of marijuana on the rise across many states, so too are those testing positive for cannabinoids, marijuana, when involved in fatal crashes. Other than marijuana, stimulants like methamphetamine, cocaine, and prescription ADHD medications, depressants and narcotics like fentanyl, morphine, oxycodone, and others are major factors in fatal crashes in 2015. How much of a factor? So here's some of the statistics. The National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, their Fatality Analysis Reporting System, or FARS, reported that there was a 9% increase in fatalities for all drivers involved in fatal crashes between 2014 and 2015. Of the 48,613 drivers involved in fatal crashes in 2015, there was a 14.1% of them were tested positive for at least one drug. And the top drug, of course, is going to be cannabinoids or marijuana, which is 7%. It's actually a 9% increase than the previous year in 2014. There's also 4.8% of them had stimulants, 4% had depressants, and 3.7% had narcotics. But specifically in the trucking industry, marijuana was found in 21% more drivers, truck drivers, involved in fatal crashes from the previous year. So between 2014 and 2015, 21% more drivers involved in fatal crashes had marijuana in their system. And the latest large truck and bus crash facts report found that the number of trucks involved in fatal crashes increased by 8% between 2014 and 2015. This is the latest numbers that we have. And there were about 4,000 truck drivers involved in fatal crashes in 2015. Interestingly, 60% of all fatal crashes involved trucks occurred on rural roads, while 25% were on interstate highways. And of about 4,000 truck drivers involved in fatal crashes, 4.6% of them tested positive for at least one drug. And the drugs, it's mostly at stimulants. You're going to see these numbers less than, of course, the general public drivers out there, because the trucking industry has established required DOT random drug testing. But stimulants had 1.8% were found having stimulants in their bodies, which is a 23% increase than the previous year. Marijuana was found in 1.5% of those fatal crashes, which is, again, is that 21% increase. And then you can see narcotics and other drugs with 1 and 2% respectively. It is important to note that in order to bring the DOT's drug testing in line with the new Health and Human Services guidelines, the DOT earlier this year had proposed adding 4 opioids to the testing panel, hydrocodone, oxycodone, oxymorphone, and hydromorphone. And the proposal is pending, but is likely, as expected, to become regulation potentially by the end of this year. Is when that ruling should happen. And many estimate that when it officially starts, about 3 to 4% more truck drivers is going to be having positive drug tests because of these added opioids to the random drug testing pool of drugs that are going to be tested. And they're going to have to start going through that SAP process, and that's why I'm bringing that up. So a lot more drivers might be seeing the SAP process, and that's another important aspect of walking through what is this SAP process and why companies should know about this. Before we go into the SAP process, though, what is considered a positive drug test for salt? And it's really pretty simple. You know, obviously, if the report from your medical review officer, your MRO, or from the lab is positive or positive dilute, this obviously signifies a positive drug test. The positive dilute, it doesn't really matter what the reason is for why it might be diluted. it had enough information in there to make it a positive, and therefore it's a positive drug test. But of course, wait, there's more. There are quite a few circumstances in which drivers may receive a positive drug test that has nothing to do with the actual drug test itself from the lab. DOT regulations prohibit drivers from refusing a test. This is in 49 CFR Part 40, Subpart I and Subpart N. The following are some of the conducts that the regulations defined as refusing a test. And you can see this list here that include failure to appear to any drug test, failure to remain at the testing site until the testing process is complete, failure to provide a urine or breath sample or a sufficient sample for any drug test, DOT drug test specifically, failure to permit the observation or monitoring of you providing a urine sample, failure to take a second test when directed to do so, failure to cooperate with any part of the testing process, failure to undergo a medical evaluation as part of a shy bladder procedures. And we actually do see a lot of these different things here come up in our testing facilities. A couple more here: providing a specimen that is verified as adulterated or substituted, automatic positive drug test, failure to cooperate with any of the part of the testing process. Mostly it's just if they say, no, I don't want to do this, we're just going to say, okay, it's positive. If you walk out, positive. Failure to follow the observer's instructions when there's an observed drug test. I've actually been a part of that observation side of things. Usually it's not an issue, but if they don't want to go through that observed collection process for a urine analysis for a drug test, it's going to be a positive drug test for them. And then admitting to the collector or the MRO that you have adulterated or substituted the specimen, it's just going to be an automatic positive drug test. And going into why these, why the return to duty regulation was created in the first place and what it's meant to accomplish. Looking at the history of it, after several significant transportation accidents, especially in the 80s and early 90s, Congress passed the Omnibus Transportation Employee Testing Act of 1991, and they did this really because they recognized that safety need for ensuring a drug and alcohol-free transportation employees. So again, that covers all the modes in the DOT. This act required DOT agencies to implement drug testing of safety-sensitive transportation employees in aviation, trucking, which includes bus drivers, limousine and van drivers, some of them, railroads, mass transit, pipeline, etc. And then in 1994, DOT added the alcohol testing requirements to its regulations. And in an open letter from a previous head of the DOT, he writes that safety is the #1 priority at the U.S. Department of Transportation, and a cornerstone of the safety policy is ensuring transportation providers across all modes employ operators who are 100% drug and alcohol free. Obviously, 100% is never likely. You know that the thresholds, I think currently if it's above 1%, the thresholds of the percentage of people being drug tested it changes, but I mean you're still seeing around 1%, 0.7% or 0.9% was this last recent number there of those being tested positive in the DOT, and that number, like I said before, with the HHS regulations and the opioid additions, those 4 opioids, it's just likely to go way over that 1%. So I know right now we're at a 50% or 25% of drivers needing to be drug tested in a pool. That's most likely going to be going up to 50%. Really, this next report that they come out with is what we are most likely going to see, if not this year, especially next year. And that's with the marijuana legalization, and that's with the opioid epidemic that's happening right now. Fortunately, for the transportation industry, over time, the DOT say they've worked hard to reduce the number of accidents and crashes directly related to drug and alcohol use, but that human risk factors remain, and some transportation workers do use illicit drugs. Employers must have that strong drug and alcohol testing program in place, and employees must be removed from safety-sensitive duties immediately after they violate the drug and alcohol testing rules, and we'll talk about that again in just a little bit. It is very important that employees are not returned to the safety-sensitive duty, such as driving a truck, until they are referred for the evaluation and have successfully completed the treatment recommendations from the substance abuse professional. So before we dive into that process, again, I'd like to talk on what does it take to be a substance abuse professional, what makes them qualified to have this significant role that could be affecting your employees. And this is actually in the DOT's regulation 49 CFR Part 40. They define the substance abuse professional as a person who evaluates employees who have violated a DOT drug and alcohol regulation and makes recommendations concerning education, treatment, follow-up testing, and aftercare. And in order to be a SAP, a person needs to have certain credentials, possesses specific knowledge, receive training, and achieve a passing score on an exam, and there's actually continued education that's required. So let's quickly dive into some of these real quick. Credentials. A person cannot be a SAP unless they are a licensed physician, a doctor of medicine, or osteopath. I'm going to screw that one up. Osteopathy. A licensed or certified social worker. They could be a licensed or certified psychologist, licensed or certified employee assistance professional. Many companies have an EAP program in their drug policies. It could be a state licensed or a certified marriage and family therapist, or an alcohol and drug abuse counselor. With a certified, here's the certifications. Certified, there's like three separate certifications that they need to have as well. I won't go into all of those, but they have to have all of these things and be these certain professionals. But that's just one tier. The knowledge, a person cannot be a SAP unless they have knowledge of and clinical experience in the diagnosis and treatment of substance abuse related disorders. They cannot be a SAP without understanding how the SAP roles relate to the special responsibilities that employers have for ensuring the safety of the traveling public, and nor can they be a SAP unless they are well informed about Part 40, pertinent to DOT agency regulations, the SAP guidelines, and any significant changes to those guidelines. And it's also important to note that the degrees and certifications that they have alone do not confer that they have the knowledge requirements. Training part of it, a person cannot be a SAP unless they received the qualified training, and that's in Section 281C of Part 40, and there's 9 required components laid out there that those are the required trainings. Following completion of these trainings, they have to complete satisfactorily an exam, and this exam must be given by a nationally recognized professional or training organization, and so it's also being aware that DOT requires those training and professionals organizations to have their SAP exams validated by a test evaluation organization. So most of the time, these SAP lists that you receive from companies, if you have one internally, or if you use a third-party drug consortium like Clean Fleet, we can provide you a SAP list. These people on that list are very much qualified to have that responsibility that's required upon them. So let's go into this process now. So the return to duty process. Really, there's 3 roles, but I'm going to break it up into like 7 different steps here. The first step is to immediately remove the driver from safety-sensitive functions, especially for trucking industry, it's driving. Even if the driver is on the road in another state, he or she must be notified to cease driving as soon as it's safe to do so. And this is really, it's a liability and safety issue to the public. They could be high at the time that they're driving, that nobody knows that. And so it's getting them out of that truck right away and then getting them drug tested. Then the next process is going to begin. But that next step sort of is you'll need to find that qualified DOT SAP if you are a DOT employee working in the safety-sensitive positions who failed that drug test previously. So maybe you went in for a random drug test. Okay, you did the drug test and you left the facility. A day or 2 later, you could still be driving out on the roads, and your company calls you saying, "Oh, results came back positive. You need to pull over when it's safe to do so." And then it's finding that SAP professional. So how do you find that qualified DOT SAP in your area? Really, it is possible if your employer, the employer can give the driver or the employees a list of SAPs to call to inquire about what fees they charge and hope that they have an appointment time that's available within the next, say, couple of weeks. Sometimes this process of going down the list and calling these SAPs to finding the right one can take a while because SAPs often have full schedules, and many times you'll need to leave messages for several of them. And if you're looking to quickly get an appointment with the SAP in your area, there are SAP referral services online that can help. And then finally, once you do get a scheduled SAP, a SAP scheduled, then you'll be starting that return to duty process. This first process, the first step of the return to duty process is being evaluated by the SAP. So let's talk about this initial evaluation. So really, there's 3 steps. Like I mentioned before, there's going to be this initial evaluation from the SAP professional. There's going to be a referral for treatment and education, and then there's going to be a final evaluation from the SAP professional. For every employee who comes for the initial evaluation, okay, you found that SAP professional, you got your meeting, you went to that meeting. What's the expectations at this meeting? Really, there's 3 things that's going to be coming from here. The SAP will provide a comprehensive face-to-face assessment and clinical evaluation in order to understand the driver, their situation and history. This evaluation could be comprised of standard psychological history, psychosocial history, in-depth drug and alcohol use history with information regarding onset, duration, frequency, and the amount of use of a substance that they've had, that they took for this positive drug test, emotional and physical characteristics of use, associated health, work, family, personal, and interpersonal problems could all be included in that history, and then a current mental status. Also, the second part is they're going to recommend a course of education and or treatment with which the employee must demonstrate successfully full compliance with those recommendations prior to returning to the safety-sensitive DOT function that they were doing. The DOT requires that that SAPs make such a recommendation for every individual who has violated a DOT drug and alcohol regulation. So that's definitely going to be a part of it. And then the third part in this initial evaluation is you're going to provide the SAP's going to provide a written report directly to the company's designated employer representative, the DER, highlighting the specific recommendations for assistance. The DER will receive this written report after the initial evaluation, and a second report is going to be coming at the final evaluation, which we'll talk about in a second. When an employee has tested positive or refused a drug test because of adulteration or substitution of the specimen, the SAP actually may consult with the medical review officer who verified the drug tests and information for the evaluation process. And the SAP the quantitation are available, and any other pertinent medical information to submit and also this information can be provided without the employee's signed release. It's important to note that the SAPs are prohibited from considering certain factors in determining recommendations for assistance, and these factors are employees' claims that the testing process was unjust or inaccurate. They'll throw that out. That's not important. Employee statements attempting to lessen the seriousness of a DOT rule violation, and also the SAP's own personal opinions about the justification and rationale for drug and alcohol testing. All of those can be pushed aside. It's going to be going on to those regulation requirements within that's laid out to them. They're neither for the employee or for the employer, and they're leaving their own personal opinions out of it. It's all the professionalism here is what's hoped to accomplish, right? Finally, the third step, that education and treatment program. The SAP's going to prescribe this program for the donor based on the initial review, and the DOT requires that every person in violation of the DOT drug and alcohol regulations must be referred to some kind of education or treatment. There's a long list of organizations, agencies, hospitals, and individual practitioners who can, in a timely manner, provide high-quality services to the employees across everything from treatment and education options. And the SAP's determining what level of assistance the employee needs with a drug and alcohol problem. If it's a big problem, maybe a long history, they're going to probably require quite a few steps in this process before they can come back to that safety-sensitive role for the DOT. And the SAP must inform the employer in writing of their decision of what this program might look like, right? And the SAP's going to send this report directly to the employer and not to a third party or entity for forwarding to the employer. It's going to go straight to the employer. And also, there's going to be no third party authorized to change the SAP's report in any way. This notification should be in letter format in the SAP's own letterhead, signed and dated by the SAP, and there's a lot of specific information that's required from this basically legal document. Employees and employers are prohibited from seeking a second SAP evaluation. Once you got that initial meeting in place and that initial eval, you can't go, oh, I don't like what I saw, I'm going to go to find another SAP. I didn't like them, I'm going to go find another SAP professional. You're going to be stuck with them. You know, we don't want you to treat that, try to cheat the system, right? They're going to be that SAP throughout this whole process. And employers are not to rely upon a second evaluation if the employee does obtain one that's contrary to this prohibition. Whatever that first one is, that's the one you're going to be going by if you see, not any second one that might come in. And again, no one may change in any way the SAP's evaluation or recommendations for assistance. So the third party, like I mentioned a little bit ago, they can't make it more or less stringent or strict based on the SAP's recommendation by changing that eval or seeking another SAP's evaluation. However, the SAP who made the initial evaluation may modify this education and treatment program based on new or additional information from an education or treatment program. So they could change that, maybe making it more strict or less strict. Fourth step in this SAP process is going to be the follow-up evaluation with the SAP. So after the employee has completed the SAP's treatment program, another eval must take place with the same substance abuse professional. At that time, he or she will determine whether the whether the employee may take a return to duty test and resume safety-sensitive functions. After this final eval, the second and final report that we mentioned earlier, this last report, is also included a recommended schedule of unannounced follow-up urine analysis, drug tests, or breath and alcohol tests that must be administered in addition to the regular ongoing random testing. We'll talk about it later too, but you can't, if a driver happens to be in got the random draw drug test and they're in the follow-up drug test as well in that same month, you can't have one drug test count for both. They're two separate drug tests, so that employee will have to go in twice. The fifth step of this stage here is that follow-up test schedule. So the SAP's going to provide the DER with a schedule of follow-up tests. In directing the follow-up testing plan, SAPs are going to specify the number and frequency of the follow-up tests. The employer would then be responsible for making sure that the individual is tested according to this plan. Follow-up testing is an important way that the employer has to determine if the employee has stopped using controlled substances or misusing alcohol. And it's important to note that the employer must conduct all of the follow-up tests as well as the return to duty tests as direct observed collections. It's going to be direct observed collections no matter what. And this includes a procedure for ensuring the employee does not have a prosthetic and any other device designed to carry clean urine or a urine substitute. So if there's any way that's going to be cheated, this process of the observed collection, they're going to make sure it's good to go. There are times when an employee will need continuing assistance with an alcohol or drug program or problem, even if the employee is ready to return to work. At these times, the SAP is going to provide the employee and employer with their recommendation for aftercare. This could be continued education or a treatment needed after return to safety-sensitive duties. So there can be cases of those after they return to safety-sensitive duties. Follow-up testing serves as more than an employer's additional assurance that an employee is performing safety-sensitive work in an alcohol-free or drug-free manner. It also serves the recovering employee as an adjunct to the total and ongoing rehab effort for them. Despite the fact that the treatment can be short-term, the rehab process for the recovering alcohol abuser or drug user usually requires a long-term effort to be part of the on the part of the employee, and so relapses may occur within that first 12 months following the treatment. This effort can actually enhance in many ways, or be enhanced in many ways during the first years and thereafter. So we're going to look at it like the schedule. So the typical SAP will provide the employer with recommended number of tests and frequencies. And for example, 4 tests in the first 6 months, because you're worried about, say, that relapse part, and then 2 tests in the final 6 months of that first year, and then 24 tests total once each month, or once each month for 24 months. You know, you can do it in various ways. Many up front, less in the back, or a regular monthly process. Moving on, there's this last part, and this can be confusing to many people and many employers, but the return to duty drug test. And the return to duty, this is where it comes in. Once the SAP confirms that the employee has successfully completed all requirements, he or she will recommend them, the DER, that the donor may take this return to duty test. This isn't another follow-up test, this is a specific return to duty test. And once this negative test result is received, the employer is going to be able to resume safety-sensitive functions. So what's the difference between return to duty versus a pre-employment test? Again, that return to duty tests are only to be given after an employee has violated the drug and alcohol program and received a positive drug test, right, or a non-negative drug test. And they must have completed initial steps of the return to duty process and then finally getting that final drug test. Also, unlike a pre-employment test, all return to duty tests, the return to duty test must be directly observed, like the follow-ups. So this means that an individual of the same sex has to accompany the employee during the entire process to ensure the integrity of the test. Also, another question that often pops up is, well, what if my what if my driver comes back from, say 2 months of vacation time? Does he need a return to duty test? Again, that's going to be no, because they never had a previous positive drug test. The return to duty only has to do with once they've completed, they got a positive drug test, they go through the SAP and return to duty process, they've done all the follow-up exams, and then there's that last return to duty. So hopefully you don't get that confused anymore if you're one of those. Finally, there's going to be the final evaluation. The SAP, to make sure that you've followed all of those requirements, that you've met the federal rules, there's going to be that last face-to-face second evaluation to determine if the employee has successfully did everything that the SAP required them to do. The SAPs making this follow-up evaluation are going to determine, they must confer and or obtain appropriate documentation from the appropriate education and treatment program the employee was referred. The SAP is going to conduct a face-to-face clinical interview with the employee to determine if the employee's demonstrated successful compliance with the initial eval. And if the employee's demonstrated successful compliance, the SAP's then going to provide that written report directly to the DER, highlighting their determination that the employee's done everything. And like we've said, there are going to be situations in which the SAP may determine that the employee successfully completed this process, but there's going to be more regimen that they must follow for the education and treatment process after returning to duty to those safety-sensitive roles. Obviously, if the employee has not demonstrated successful compliance of the SAP's recommendations, they will provide a written notice of this directly to the DER, and there's going to be more process for them to finish, right? So that's that SAP process, the return to duty process. Now you know it. There are going to be cases, though, that this could affect your non-CDL drivers, and many times this could be because many non-CDL drivers, you could drive a commercial motor vehicle that you don't need a CDL license for. This can be in like the construction industry, for example, and you might be hiring a previous, say, truck driver who got caught with a positive drug test and maybe was let go and couldn't find another job, for example. And so they went to drive for another company for a non-CDL role. They could still be affected with this process. Specifically, it comes to, Part 391 talks about the FMCSR's state that a Schedule I drug, so like marijuana, for example, it's still a Schedule I drug, that a driver's automatic disqualification from operating a commercial motor vehicle. And the two ways that they determine this, it's going to be on the federal forms before their physical. So obviously they have to go in for a physical in order to drive a commercial motor vehicle due to DOT regulations. For this physical that they're going into, there's a form that asks two questions of many of the questions, but there's 2 questions on there that they could basically reply yes to, and will disqualify them. The first question is, have you used an illegal substance within the past 2 years? And the second question, have you ever failed a drug test or been dependent on an illegal substance? The first question is referring to any federal Schedule I drug specifically. This includes marijuana. So his history, if you've gone through a SAP process, you've got a positive drug test on record, you're going to have to mark yes on this. And you're going to be automatically disqualified and will not receive the required medical card in order to drive a CMV. Also, if the driver marks yes to the second question, which is referring to a failure of that federal drug test, the driver is not automatically disqualified. However, some medical examiners may want the driver to take a non-federal drug test to make sure, okay, where are you at right now? Now that you're not required in a random drug test pool, have you started using drugs on a regular basis? And you know, they just want to maybe verify that they're going to need to have a drug test. And if they fail that drug test, they're not going to get their medical card. So that can affect your non-CDL drivers. And both scenarios have come up in our own clinics. For example, we had a driver come in last December for a DOT physical. He had extreme weight loss in a short time frame. This often, and other characteristics that signify some kind of drug use. And our medical examiner wanted the driver to take a drug test, which had non-negative results. So basically, it's a positive drug test, and the driver did not qualify for the medical card to drive the CMV. And many times these drivers could be, like I said, CDL drivers who were let go due to a positive drug test in the past, even though they might have completed their SAP process. Moving on, there are other common questions regarding the return to duty process I'm going to cover here real quickly. How many follow-up tests have to be taken? The DOT requires the SAP to schedule a minimum of 6 tests over a 12-month period, but the process may continue for up to 5 years. Like the return to duty test, each of the follow-up tests must be taken under direct observation. Do follow-up tests replace random testing? I sort of touched on this before, and the answer is no. Just like all drivers, the employee must be included in that random testing pool and complete any selection that he or she may receive. A random test cannot count also for a follow-up test, and a follow-up test cannot replace a random test. But that random test does not have to be under direct observation. The follow-up test does. Does the company or driver have to pay for the SAP program and test, or which one, right? It's important to note that the employers are not required to provide a SAP evaluation or any subsequent recommended education or treatment for an employee. However, if the employer offers the employee an opportunity to return to DOT safety-sensitive duty, the employer must ensure that the employee goes through this entire SAP process, right? Payments obviously left for employers and employees to decide. It may be determined by existing management and labor agreements, employer policies, or healthcare benefits. So it's up to you as the employer and whatever your policies state. Another question, my driver is returning after being on leave. Does he or she need to take a return to duty? This is where I mentioned the vacation. Again, no. The return to duty only has to do with the violation of having a positive drug test, going through the entire SAP return to duty process, and then that's when the return to duty test actually takes place. And then what if I'm fired from my company or start my own company? All employment decisions belong solely to the employer. DOT regs do not address employment actions such as hiring, firing, or leave of absence. DOT and the United States Coast Guard regulations may prohibit you from performing your safety-sensitive functions after a positive test result or refusal to submit to testing, you should be aware that a positive adulterated or substituted DOT drug and alcohol test may trigger consequences based on company policy or employment agreement. Finally, moving on, how long must I keep records? I'm not going to walk through all of this, and this is just 3 of the many modes in the DOT. But specifically, the SAP reports and the evaluations, that's going to be a 5-year record requirement. And you can look at the other requirements regarding DOT drug testing and what the employer might need to do with that. United States Coast Guard, and actually with everything with the SAP process, the SAP information, it's no matter what mode of the DOT, it's going to be a 5-year record-keeping requirement. If you have any questions on DOT rules on record keeping, I can give you this full list and in an email. Just email me. Moving on to the DOT Clearinghouse changes. So specifically for record keeping requirements, first, what's the DOT Clearinghouse? The DOT established a central database to contain all of the relevant drug and alcohol testing info for commercial drivers, and this is going to be called the Commercial Driver's License Drug and Alcohol Clearinghouse. And it's been about 4 years since Congress called for the National Clearinghouse for truck drivers, and the purpose of it really is to prevent CDL holders with a positive drug and alcohol test result, refusal of drug and alcohol results, or who've gone a return to duty drug test, from really job hopping, moving to different states where the results do not follow them, for example. This clearinghouse will make it harder to hire these drivers and keeping the roads safer is what the DOT says. Once the database is ready, I believe it should be about 2020, commercial drivers and there's going to be people that need to sort of register to the clearinghouse. And there's really 2 reasons why anyone's going to need to query the database, and 2 types of database checks. There's going to be a full detailed query and a limited query. So real quick touch point here, for pre-employment purposes, there's going to be a full query of everything with that driver, the history of what's in there, required to check all that information. If there's any outstanding positive test results, et cetera, this type of check is going to be full detailed. Now, if you're doing an annual screening on your drivers, there's going to be an annual screening on your drivers. Okay, I got to go check, has anything new popped up on positive drug tests, for example, or something like that. A limited query is going to be done annually in this database. If there is something that pops up, then a full query is going to happen after that. So what's actually going to be reported to the DOT Drug and Alcohol Clearinghouse database? The SAPs are going to report for each driver who's completed the return to duty process, and then employers or consortiums and TPAs like Clean Fleet, they're going to report alcohol confirmed test results, a refusal to test, and a report that the driver completed all follow-up tests prescribed in the SAP report. So the employer is going to need to put in that SAP report. The substance abuse professional is going to put in the return to duty process that they've completed it. And the MRO is actually obviously going to put in the verified positive adulterated or substituted controlled substance test results or refusals on their end as well. And how long will the information be in the database? For record keeping requirements, for the database info, drug and alcohol violations are going to remain in the clearinghouse for 5 years or until the driver completes the return to duty process, whichever happens later. And the employer record keeping for annual queries, the employers must retain for 3 years a record of each query and all information received in response for the driver. So that's just a quick snapshot of it. Don't need to worry about it for a while, but that's just what's coming. moving on, this is the last slide here that we're going to talk about. So how can you simplify this SAP process? And really it comes down to having a third party that specializes in making sure everything from record keeping, managing multiple relationships, you know, for example, like CleanFleet, we have a SAP list that we can give out, secure storing of the important documents, and just managing the entire random testing employee pool. We make sure that any follow-up tests, that those are going to be done, or they're going to be scheduled wherever the driver's at. If it's a random test, for example, and if you're not happy with your with your TPA now, or if you don't have a drug consortium, we have a long list of things that we at CleanFleet, we believe that we are a best-in-class drug and alcohol testing site for the Portland, Oregon area, let alone a TPA and consortium. We manage thousands of clients of ours across the United States, and we have over 3,000 collection facilities across the U.S. that we work with, so we can get drivers in wherever they're at. We've got a great track record on that. And we also do driver cards, accident kits, collection site management, record keeping and reporting assistance, et cetera, et cetera. So you can follow up with CleanFleet. You can go to our website or give our professional staff a call at the phone number that you see in our slides. And really, I'm going to wrap it up now. If there's any questions, please type it into the chat box. I know right now there is not. I definitely do thank you guys for attending the webinar today. I'm going to give you guys about a minute or so. Really, if I see any pop up in the chat box that you're typing, I'll give you just about a minute here, and then we'll wrap up shop. It looks like I'm not seeing anybody having any questions. So before we let you go, I just do want to mention, again, thank you for attending this webinar. Hopefully it was helpful. I am going to have this information, the recording and the slides sent out to you. Look for it tomorrow. But next month, the October webinar is everything you need to know about background checks when hiring. It's going to be held, I believe it's the third Thursday, October 19th in October there. Be sure to go online to register for that. And really with that, I conclude this webinar again. Thank you all for attending. Hope to see you next month, and have a great rest of your day and week.